Is in vitro fertilization a biblically acceptable alternative for couples who are unable to conceive children naturally? Dr. David K. Bernard addresses this important issue on this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. Welcome to Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, a podcast dedicated to helping modern-day believers live out the teachings of the first century church. This podcast is part of the teaching ministry of Dr. David K. Bernard. Dr. Bernard has dedicated his life to studying the Bible and helping believers apply its message to their daily lives. In Apostolic Life in the 21st Century, Dr. Bernard answers your questions about what the Bible teaches and how those teachings apply to everyday life. Earlier this summer, the Southern Baptist Convention, which is, as most people know, is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, they voted to condemn the use of in vitro fertilization, often referred to as IVF. And the controversy stems from the fact that IVF involves creating more embryos than what can actually be implanted. And so the Southern Baptists argue that this process then, because embryos are destroyed, they consider that, and the church considers that human life, they consider that ethically problematic. Does the United Pentecostal Church have any sort of stance on in vitro fertilization? And if so, what would it be?
Well, first of all, the UPCI has a very clear stand that's pro-life and against abortion. So we do believe that life begins with conception in the womb, human life, that God, as for example, Psalm 139, God forms the human in the womb. There are examples as Jeremiah spoke of God, but God said, I've called you, formed you in the womb, and so forth. So we definitely stand against abortion in all forms, and we have a clear statement on that. We do not oppose birth control, although there are some methods that may involve, in effect, abortion, so we would not be in favor of that. And we do not have a statement regarding in vitro fertilization. And there again, we're not opposed to the concept or the principle. So the idea that if someone's having trouble conceiving naturally, that you would take the husband and wife, of course, we would see it's appropriate within marriage. We would have problems using the egg or sperm from a third party. That would raise other questions. But if you're talking about a husband and wife trying to conceive, we don't oppose methods that would help them be successful in conceiving and bearing their child. But as you mentioned, the problem is not so much the technique, but in order to increase the odds of success, many times multiple embryos are created, and then if they're not needed, they're discarded. So we'd be opposed to that aspect. But if it's possible, and even though this may decrease the odds and therefore increase the expense, but if the couple would make sure that whatever embryos are conceived, that they would be implanted. So if they're going to just do one, or if they are willing to have the possibility of multiple births, they could do 2 or 3. The chances are when you use this process that not all the eggs will be fertilized, and even if they are fertilized, not all of them will survive. So it's kind of a playing the odds that you start with a process of multiple eggs, but you end up with maybe much fewer conceptions and embryos. So I think to summarize, we are not opposed to the concept, to the principle of helping a husband and wife conceive their own child. And if they have a medical issue or physical issue, finding some workaround to successfully achieve that. I think that's fine. But the challenge is in talking to the doctors, what process is being used, and are we committed that any embryos that are conceived will be implanted? And if for some reason there is a discrepancy, then sometimes embryos are frozen for later use. And there are some Christians who actually adopt frozen embryos. So that's again another issue, but that's a consideration that that perhaps adoption, of course, is a biblical option, I think. So adopting a child that's been born, but maybe even adopting an embryo that has been frozen, that might be another alternative for Christian adoption. So I think a couple that is not able to conceive, they could consider this medical option under limited circumstances with pro-life, with a pro-life mentality or pro-life philosophy, but they could also consider adoption. And finally, we have many examples where God has touched someone miraculously and they're able to conceive. So we certainly believe in the power of God. So I would say that a couple should consider all options, including trusting God and asking God to do a miracle. If they want to consider IVF, then take into consideration our belief that life begins at conception, and they could consider adoption. We do have an endorsed adoption agency, New Beginnings, and we also have a children's home, endorsed children's home, Tupelo Children's Mansion, that often has children that they're able to place. So we have a variety of options for families today. I think they should look at all of those options and seek God and ask God for direction in their particular case.
And I'd like to add, you mentioned our statement on sanctity of human life. You can find that on our website, upci.org. And if you just go and search for Statement Archive, you can find all of our statements. There's also a drop-down menu. You can select that option and see that statement as well as all of our other official statements.
And I will add, we amended our Articles of Faith to have a few key phrases to anchor some of these position papers. So one of the things we added is that we believe in life, both unborn, in the womb. And so that was an attempt to say we are pro-life, and for more, so it's in our Articles of Faith, but if you want more detail, you go to our position paper.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Apostolic Life in the 21st Century. If you enjoy this podcast, please take a moment to give us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or your favorite podcast app. We also appreciate it when you share Apostolic Life in the 21st Century with a friend or family member. And make plans to join us again next time as we look at how the Bible applies to everyday life.